Mason Reed walked into the five-star hotel through a curtain of rain, coat-soaked, one hand pressed against a sealed envelope inside his jacket. He wanted only a quiet room before the meeting that would decide tomorrow's future. The receptionist studied him like a man who had wandered into the wrong building, summoned security within minutes, and announced that this hotel was not meant for someone like him. No one in that gleaming lobby knew the humiliated single father before them was the true owner of the entire tower bore. When the private elevator opened, the whole room fell silent. If anyone wonders how far Mason went to make that hotel pay for his humiliation, stay until the very end. Rain fell over midtown Manhattan in long silver sheets, washing over the glass towers and pooling along the sidewalks where doormen huddled under awnings. At the center of it all, the Reed Horizon Grand glowed like something carved out of gold, its windows blazing against the storm, every chandelier inside lit for a relaunch that would happen the following morning. The hotel had become the newest symbol of old money and new ambition, a place where chief executives, senators, and quiet billionaires arrived without ever waiting in line. Investors called it the finest address in the city. Staff called it untouchable. Neither group understood how close that word was about to become a curse. A taxi pulled to the curb, ordinary and a little battered, and Mason Reed stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. There was no driver waiting for him, no security trailing behind, no tailored suit announcing his arrival. He wore a plain dark coat, a gray shirt beneath it, dark trousers, and shoes that had clearly been resoled more than once, though they were spotless. In his hand he carried a leather envelope, sealed, holding the final transfer documents, an internal investigation report, and a decision that would reshape the hotel's entire leadership before sunrise. Mason had not come to flaunt anything. He had come to look quietly at how the hotel treated an ordinary stranger when nobody thought anyone important was watching. Years earlier he had slept in a train station, with nothing but a duffel bag for a pillow, and long before that he had carried suitcases for guests who never looked him in the eye. He had built his fortune slowly, almost invisibly, through a private investment fund designed never to draw attention, and through that fund he had acquired the Reed Horizon Grand without a single headline announcing his name. He wanted to see, with his own eyes and without his title attached, whether the hotel he now owned treated people with the dignity his mother always said mattered more than any chandelier or marble floor. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, and the screen lit up with a single word, Charlotte. He answered quietly, his voice softening the way it always did for her. She only wanted to know if he had arrived somewhere safe, the way children ask when they sense their parent is carrying more weight than they let on. Mason told her he was fine, told her to get some sleep, and slid the phone back into his coat before stepping toward the revolving doors. A security camera near the entrance turned slightly as he approached, almost as if the building itself sensed that something worth recording was about to begin. Inside, the lobby unfolded in marble and brass, warm light pouring from crystal fixtures, a grand piano playing somewhere unseen. It was a world built entirely apart from the plain, rain-soaked man walking into it. Behind the front desk, Madison Cole glanced up and studied him for a long moment, her expression sliding quickly from neutral to skeptical. Nearby, Ryan Blake stood with a wealthy couple, nodding along to their conversation with practiced charm, but his eyes flicked toward Mason the instant he crossed the threshold. Ryan did not move to greet him. He simply watched, the way a man watches something he has already decided does not belong. The air in the lobby remained calm on the surface, yet something tightened beneath it, an unspoken tension settling over the space the moment Mason stepped inside. He had just walked into a building he owned outright, into rooms paid for with money he alone controlled, and not a single person standing there had any idea. For now he was simply a stranger in wet shoes, and the hotel was about to show him exactly what it had become when nobody important seemed to be looking. Mason approached the front desk and spoke evenly, telling Madison that he had a reservation under the name Mason Reed. She did not check the system right away. Instead, she asked, almost lazily, if he was certain he had the right hotel. Mason kept his tone calm, repeated the name on the reservation, and slid his identification across the counter. Madison looked at it, then typed with a slowness that felt less like diligence and more like a small, deliberate punishment. The screen in front of her showed a private penthouse suite held under the name Mason Reed, flagged for internal review. But since she had no idea who he actually was, she assumed the listing had to be in error. She told him flatly that the suite could not possibly be his, since it was reserved for guests at the very highest tier. Mason asked gently, why a name that matched his identification and a reservation that matched his paperwork would not be enough. Madison's composure slipped for a moment before she recovered it, insisting the hotel reserved the right to refuse service whenever a booking looked suspicious. Ryan Blake drifted closer, his voice smooth and polite in front of the other guests nearby, though contempt slid underneath every word. He asked whether Mason had the means to cover a deposit at all. Mason said nothing in anger. He simply produced a black corporate card, but Ryan would not even touch it. Ryan said cards like that were easy to forge, and that the hotel could not risk trouble on the eve of its relaunch. A few guests across the lobby began to glance over, drawn by the rising tension near the desk. Madison spoke just loudly enough for others to hear, claiming the hotel had dealt with strangers pretending to be important guests before. Mason understood in that moment that this had stopped being a simple mistake and had become something closer to a performance of cruelty. He asked whether Ryan would like to call someone with greater authority. Ryan laughed under his breath and said that at this desk, he was the highest authority there was. Mason repeated quietly that all he wanted was a room, nothing more, no scene, no trouble. Ryan told him the trouble had started the moment he walked through the door. It was a small sentence, almost throwaway, yet it carried the full weight of everything underneath it. Carter Hayes, the head of security, arrived a moment later at Ryan's signal, his broad frame positioning itself close enough to intimidate without yet making contact. He told Mason it would be best if he left the lobby immediately. Mason did not raise his voice or pull away. He simply stood there, steady, watching Carter with an expression that held no fear at all. Lisa Bennett, a housekeeping employee passing through with a cart of linens, slowed when she saw what was unfolding. She quietly told Madison that if the system showed a name matching the guest, someone should double-check the listing before doing anything else. Ryan turned on her immediately, snapping that she should return to the staff corridor and mind her own duties. Lisa fell silent, though something in her eyes refused to agree with what she had just witnessed. Across the lounge, Grace Miller, an economics journalist waiting for an interview scheduled for the next morning, lifted her gaze from her notebook and began watching closely without a word. Mason glanced up at the security camera mounted near the ceiling, aware that every second of this was being recorded somewhere. He asked, in a voice almost too quiet to carry, whether the hotel always treated its guests this way. Ryan answered without hesitation, telling him it only happened to people who did not belong there. The sentence landed like a verdict, and the lobby seemed to hold its breath around it. Ryan gestured for Carter to escort Mason out of the lobby entirely. Carter placed a hand on his arm, but Mason did not flinch or pull away, only looked at him directly, with a steadiness that did not match what a frightened man would show. He told Carter quietly to think carefully before laying hands on a guest who had done nothing wrong. Something in that calm made Carter hesitate, his grip loosening just slightly, as though some instinct in him recognized he was not dealing with the kind of man Ryan assumed. Madison, emboldened by Ryan's confidence, called Mason a vagrant dressed up to look respectable. A couple of well-dressed guests nearby laughed under their breath, turning what had been quiet cruelty into something openly public. Mason did not answer with anger. He simply asked Madison for her full name and her position at the hotel. She assumed he intended some kind of complaint and gave both with a defiant edge in her voice. Ryan introduced himself as well, almost proudly, as if naming himself confirmed his authority rather than exposing it. Mason pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and wrote both names down without remark. Ryan mocked him, saying that writing names in a notebook would not get him a room. Mason asked whether either of them had ever received training on guest treatment, discrimination policy, or how internal reservations for high-level guests were meant to be handled. Ryan told him sharply that he had no right to ask about internal procedure. Mason then asked to speak with Evelyn Carter, the acting chief executive of the hotel group. Both Ryan and Madison froze for a beat, confused by how a stranger off the street would even know that name. Ryan masked his surprise quickly, claiming Evelyn did not meet with unscheduled guests under any circumstance. Mason answered simply that he had an appointment. Madison turned back to her screen and pulled up an internal note that read, in plain text, "Owner arrival, private review." For a single second her face betrayed real alarm, but Ryan leaned over, saw the same words, and told her to close the file immediately. Ryan convinced himself this had to be either a clerical error or some elaborate trick, and decided the safest move was to bury it, rather than question it. In front of the gathering onlookers, he announced loudly that there was no appointment of any kind. Mason understood exactly what had happened, that Ryan had seen the truth on that screen and chosen to lie anyway, in front of witnesses. Without hesitation, Lisa, still lingering near enough to notice, caught the flicker across both their faces and began to suspect that this was no ordinary guest standing before them. Mason held out the sealed envelope, explaining that it contained a confirmation letter from the board of directors. Ryan did not read it. He shoved it aside, across the counter without even glancing at the seal. The envelope slid and dropped to the floor, one corner tearing open just enough to reveal the edge of an official legal stamp beneath the lobby lighting. The room seemed to go quieter still, the kind of silence that settles right before something breaks. Mason bent down and picked it up slowly, an act that should have looked humiliating yet somehow did not, because his composure never wavered even as the moment stretched painfully long. He had been underestimated more times in his life than he could count, but this time felt different, because the wound was no longer only personal. It exposed a sickness running through the very company he had just spent years quietly purchasing. Carter asked him, one final time, to leave the premises. Mason checked his watch, looked up calmly, and said they would do this the proper way instead. He raised his phone and sent a single message to Evelyn that read only, "Lobby now," while Ryan stood there with no idea he had just signed off on his own dismissal. The private elevator behind the lobby desk opened without warning, its doors parting with a soft chime that somehow sounded louder than anything else in the room. Evelyn Carter stepped out in a tailored suit, two legal assistants, and an internal auditor following close behind her, their footsteps unhurried but deliberate against the marble. The entire lobby fell quiet at once, since everyone present knew Evelyn was the woman overseeing the relaunch, the one whose name appeared on every memo and every schedule taped inside the staff corridor. Ryan's face drained of color, though he tried to hold on to something resembling professionalism. Madison straightened her posture, attempting to mask the panic rising in her chest. Even the pianist near the far wall let the final notes of a song trail off into silence. Evelyn did not look at Ryan first. She walked straight toward Mason, and in front of the entire lobby she addressed him as Mr. Reed, her voice carrying genuine respect that startled everyone watching. Ryan, Madison, and Carter froze completely where they stood, the air around them suddenly heavier than it had been a moment before. Mason showed no triumph in his expression. He simply gave a small nod, calm as ever, as though he had expected exactly this and nothing more. Evelyn asked if he was all right. Mason said he was fine, but the hotel was not. The sentence became the hinge upon which the entire night turned. Ryan rushed to explain that this had all been a misunderstanding, insisting Mason simply had not looked the way a high-level guest usually looked. Evelyn answered coldly, asking since when appearance had become a condition for receiving a room. Madison tried to claim the booking system had malfunctioned somehow. Evelyn ordered the reservation file pulled up immediately on the large screen mounted behind the management desk. The record displayed clearly, Mason Reed, new controlling owner, private penthouse suite, flagged for a discreet review ahead of the public announcement. A murmur rippled through the lobby, guests leaning toward one another, whispers spreading faster than anyone could contain them. Grace Miller realized in that instant that this had become a far bigger story than a simple desk dispute. and she set her notebook quietly on her knee, listening more closely than before. Ryan tried shifting blame onto Madison, claiming she had handled the situation from the very beginning. Madison fired back, insisting Ryan had seen the internal note himself and told her to close it. Carter stood silent, slowly grasping that he had been pulled into something deeply wrong, his earlier confidence draining out of him with every passing second. Mason asked that no one leave their post until the camera footage and system logs had been fully reviewed. Evelyn ordered all booking data locked from further edits for the remainder of the night, her tone leaving no room for argument. The internal auditor immediately accessed security footage, computer logs, and internal call recordings, working at a small terminal wheeled out from behind the desk. Lisa stood at the edge of the lobby, anxious, aware she had spoken up earlier on Mason's behalf and uncertain whether that honesty would cost her something. Mason looked toward her and said gently that she should stay, because what she had to say mattered. The moment offered a small but vital humanizing beat, proof that Mason was not simply punishing wrongdoing but recognizing decency wherever he found it, however quiet that decency had been. Ryan, losing his composure entirely, accused Mason of humiliating staff in front of paying guests. Mason answered that it was Ryan who had chosen to make this public in the first place, and that nothing about his own conduct tonight had ever been anything but calm. Evelyn instructed the lounge area, closed, and asked unrelated guests to move toward the restaurant, though Grace requested to remain as a press witness. Mason agreed, since the truth required no concealment. What had begun as Mason's humiliation had quietly transformed into something closer to a hearing, held right there in the middle of the lobby floor, beneath chandeliers that suddenly felt far less impressive than they had an hour earlier. Evelyn explained briefly to the gathered management team that Reed Horizon Grand had recently been acquired through a quiet transaction, far away from any public announcement or press release of any kind. The new owner had requested a direct inspection of the hotel's service culture before the relaunch could move forward in good conscience, a request that had seemed almost excessive at the time it was made. Mason himself had proposed walking through the lobby as an ordinary guest, simply to see how staff behaved when nobody important seemed to be watching them. What he had not expected was discovering a problem deeper than anything the earlier reports had hinted at, something woven into daily habit rather than isolated to one bad evening. Over the previous 3 months, numerous complaints had arrived from guests of color, from guests dressed plainly, from older guests, and from lower-level staff who had tried to raise concerns of their own through proper reporting routes. Every one of those complaints had been flagged internally as disruptive guest behavior, then quietly closed without further review, buried beneath routine paperwork nobody bothered to question. Ryan had personally approved the majority of those closures, his signature appearing again and again across files that should have triggered real concern. Madison appeared repeatedly within the complaint records, cited for cold and dismissive treatment toward anyone she judged unworthy of attention or warmth. Carter had been accused more than once of using security as a tool of intimidation rather than protection, his presence used to frighten rather than reassure. Mason had previously instructed Evelyn never to dismiss anyone based solely on paperwork, insisting that direct evidence mattered more than written accusations alone. Tonight, Ryan and Madison had provided exactly that evidence themselves, in full view of witnesses who would not soon forget it. Ryan insisted the complaints had been fabricated, his voice rising with the particular desperation of a man watching his story collapse in real time. Evelyn produced camera logs from several earlier weeks, an elderly man removed for wearing work clothing, a businesswoman questioned about her ability to pay before she had even checked in, a couple quietly relocated because they did not fit the hotel's preferred image. None of these incidents needed lengthy description. Together they painted a pattern, not a misunderstanding, proof of a system built on prejudice rather than a single employee's mistake made under pressure. Lisa confirmed she had witnessed several guests treated poorly over the years, though lower-level staff rarely dared speak up about it for fear of losing shifts or favor. Ryan shot her a look meant to intimidate, but Mason told him plainly that he would not be allowed to look at any employee that way again, not while he stood in that room. Joseph Walker, Mason's personal attorney, entered the lobby moments later, having received an urgent message from Evelyn earlier that night. He carried a legal file confirming Mason held controlling ownership of 82% of the hotel's shares, every signature notarized and unmistakable beneath the harsh light. Ryan nearly lost his footing entirely, reaching for the edge of the desk to steady himself. Madison began crying, though it seemed driven less by genuine remorse than by sudden fear of losing her position and everything attached to it. Mason asked her a simple pointed question. If the man standing before her had not turned out to be the hotel's owner, would she ever have apologized at all? Madison said nothing because there was nothing honest she could say that would not condemn her further. That single question struck at the very moral center of everything happening that night. Carter, to his credit, admitted he had simply followed Ryan's orders without thinking it through carefully enough. Mason told him that following orders did not erase responsibility when an innocent person had been threatened because of it. Grace Miller took careful notes, though Mason asked her directly not to turn Lisa or any other junior staff member into a media target. It was a small request that revealed something important about him, that he held real power yet refused to wield it carelessly or without thought for who might get hurt by it. Evelyn announced that the board would convene an emergency session immediately, right there inside the hotel's executive offices upstairs. Mason decided there was no reason to wait until morning to do what clearly needed doing. Whatever needed to happen would happen that very night, while the evidence was still fresh and the truth still impossible to deny. Years earlier, when Mason had been a young man carrying suitcases for guests who barely looked his way, his mother worked the overnight shift at a small, modest hotel across town, folding towels long after midnight while raising a son on her own. She used to tell him that a hotel never really sold rooms at all, that what it actually sold was the feeling of being respected at the exact moment a person felt most exhausted, most far from home, most in need of a kind word. After she passed away, Mason kept working while studying finance at night, determined to build something better than what either of them had ever known, even when exhaustion made the path feel impossible some weeks. He had once been passed over for a promotion simply because he lacked an impressive degree or polished connections. Yet he refused to let that rejection harden into bitterness. Instead, Mason began investing quietly in struggling hotels, rebuilding their internal processes, protecting employees who actually cared about their work, and slowly establishing a reputation for fairness within an industry that rarely valued it. He became a private, almost invisible businessman, someone who avoided headlines and preferred his name stay out of any spotlight, content to let results speak louder than his presence ever could. Becoming a single father only deepened that caution, since he guarded his time and his reputation more carefully. Once Charlotte depended on him for everything that mattered. Charlotte was the reason Mason never allowed cynicism to curdle into cruelty. A single photograph lived inside his wallet, one small image of her laughing beside him in a park, nothing more elaborate than that, a quiet anchor rather than a spotlight. Reed Horizon Grand had been the very hotel his mother once dreamed of staying in for just one night, though she never earned enough to afford it, and the dream had stayed lodged in Mason's chest long after she was gone. Mason purchased it not purely for profit, but because he wanted it to become a new symbol of decency within an industry built on luxury for its own sake. After the acquisition closed, however, he discovered a culture that had rotted quietly beneath its polished surface. Ryan had built what amounted to an invisible filter at the front desk. Anyone who looked wealthy received warmth, while anyone who looked ordinary received suspicion, regardless of what their reservation or their character actually showed. Madison had been elevated by Ryan because she knew how to flatter powerful guests while remaining cold toward anyone she judged beneath her notice. Carter had turned hotel security into a quiet instrument of intimidation rather than genuine protection, a tool wielded against the powerless rather than against any real threat. Mason had resisted firing people en masse without certainty, understanding that many employees simply absorbed whatever culture surrounded them without choosing it consciously, and he wanted proof before he acted. But tonight had erased any remaining doubt. What had happened in that lobby was no longer a matter of suspicion or rumor. The reflection closed on an image of Mason sitting alone in the executive office, looking down through the glass at the very lobby where he had just been humiliated only an hour before, the rain still streaking the windows behind him. He did not feel anger over the rejection itself, not really, not in any way that mattered most. What angered him was the thought that if the man denied a room that night had truly been poor, truly without power, truly without any private fortune hidden behind him, he would have been pushed back out into the rain with nowhere else to go. That single thought became the moral engine driving every decision Mason was about to make. It was not about pride, and it had never been about revenge. It was about making certain that no one else would ever be cast out of a warm lobby into a cold, wet night simply because of how they looked standing at the door. Mason, Evelyn, Joseph, Ryan, Madison, Carter, Lisa, and the auditing team moved upstairs into the executive office on the highest floor. The atmosphere felt entirely different from the lobby below, quieter, colder, lit in clean white light, screens along the wall displaying camera footage, and the long list of complaints pulled from the archive. Outside the tall windows, rain still streaked the glass, blurring the city lights into long smears of color. Mason sat at the far end of the table without performing any sense of power. He simply set his folder down and listened carefully to each person in turn, his expression unreadable, but never unkind. Ryan opened with a formal-sounding apology, claiming he was deeply sorry for the misunderstanding, his voice rehearsed in a way that made the apology feel hollow before it even finished. Mason asked him plainly where exactly the misunderstanding had occurred. Since the name matched, the identification matched, the payment card was valid, and the internal note had been perfectly clear, Ryan had no answer for that, and the silence stretched longer than he clearly wanted it to. Madison claimed she had only been following what she believed were standard protective procedures. Evelyn asked her to point to the written policy describing those procedures, her tone patient but unyielding. Madison fell silent because no such policy existed anywhere on paper. It existed only inside long-held assumptions about who deserved welcome and who did not. Carter said he had simply been called in to handle a security situation. Mason asked him directly who in that situation had actually posed any danger to anyone. Carter lowered his head and admitted that Mason had never posed any danger at all. Lisa was invited to speak next. Her voice trembled slightly, but she explained that many staff members had wanted to report Ryan's behavior for a long time, only to find themselves assigned worse shifts or fewer hours whenever they tried. Ryan denied it immediately, but Evelyn produced the actual scheduling records, proving Lisa's account to be accurate down to the date. Madison, it turned out, had repeatedly received favorable shifts and bonuses in exchange for helping bury earlier complaints against Ryan. Joseph laid out the legal exposure clearly: potential lawsuits over discriminatory treatment, abuse of security authority, and the deliberate falsification of complaint records, each one capable of damaging the hotel far beyond a single bad headline. Mason asked Ryan, quietly, why he had done any of this. Ryan finally revealed his true reasoning, saying a five-star hotel had to protect its image and could not allow just anyone to walk through its doors. Mason answered that no image worth protecting was ever built by humiliating people, and that the moment a hotel needed cruelty to feel exclusive, it had already lost whatever it was trying to protect. Ryan, losing whatever composure remained, said it was easy for Mason to talk that way now that he owned the place, while Ryan had only been trying to uphold a standard. Mason reminded him that the highest standard in hospitality had always been making every legitimate guest feel safe, not feared. Madison began pleading for another chance, saying she genuinely needed this job to survive. Mason asked her how many times she had made another person feel as though they did not deserve to walk through that door at all. Madison had no answer to offer. Carter, more honest than the other two, admitted that the pressure of his position had clouded his judgment over time. Mason acknowledged that honesty, yet made clear that consequences still had to follow regardless of intent. Evelyn proposed suspending all three pending a fuller investigation, but Mason decided the evidence already gathered was more than sufficient to act immediately. Ryan and Madison were terminated on the spot for deliberate discrimination, for concealing the reservation information, and for manipulating the hotel's complaint records over an extended period. Carter was suspended without pay, required to participate fully in the ongoing investigation and retraining, with any final decision depending on how completely he cooperated going forward. Ryan exploded, slamming his hand against the table, shouting that Mason was destroying his entire career over a single night. Mason answered evenly that Ryan had destroyed it himself, one moment at a time, every single instance he decided another human being did not deserve respect. That line became the emotional detonation point of the entire confrontation. Ryan was escorted from the room by newly arrived senior security personnel that Evelyn had called in specifically for this purpose. Madison followed behind him, her expression utterly collapsed. Mason felt no satisfaction in any of it. He only felt tired because firing people was never a victory, only the first necessary step toward repairing something broken. After Ryan and Madison were gone, Mason shifted his attention away from punishment and toward rebuilding, his exhaustion from the long night barely showing on his face. He told Evelyn that firing a handful of people would let the hotel quietly convince itself the problem had already been solved, when in truth it had only been exposed for the first time. Mason asked for a full audit of the front desk, security, guest services, and human resources, leaving no department untouched and no shortcut taken. Every complaint closed over the previous 2 years would need to be reopened and reviewed without exception, no matter how minor it had once seemed on paper. Guests who had been mistreated would receive a formal apology along with appropriate compensation, handled with care rather than as a quiet legal formality buried in fine print. Employees who had once tried to speak honestly and been punished for it would now be protected from any further retaliation. Lisa was offered a temporary advisory role helping design a new training program focused on service culture, since she understood how the hotel actually functioned at ground level far better than anyone seated in a glass office above it. Lisa seemed startled by the offer, insisting she was simply a housekeeping employee with no special qualifications. Mason told her that sometimes the person who understood a hotel's true heart was not the one sitting behind an executive desk, but the one who saw every hallway, every door, and every tired guest up close. Evelyn fully supported the decision without hesitation. Mason asked that a new policy be drafted immediately. No employee would ever be permitted to judge another person's worth or financial capability based on clothing, accent, skin color, profession, or age. Security could only intervene when there was a genuine threat present, never simply because a manager felt personally uncomfortable around someone. Managers themselves would be trained to verify facts through proper reporting lines before reaching for authority at all. Joseph suggested announcing these reforms only after the relaunch concluded, hoping to avoid stirring a public relations crisis before the hotel even reopened its doors. Mason refused outright to hide any part of what had happened. He said plainly that if the hotel intended to open its doors again, it needed to open them with the truth standing fully in the light. Grace Miller was invited into the executive office to hear the official statement directly from him. Mason made clear he did not want a sensational story painting him as a secret owner exacting revenge on his own staff. What he wanted instead was a simple, honest message. A luxury hotel had just been forced to remember that human dignity carries no room number and requires no reservation in advance. Grace was visibly struck by how carefully Mason controlled the narrative without ever softening the truth inside it. Evelyn began drafting an internal memo to send to every employee before sunrise. Mason specifically asked that Lisa not be named publicly as the one who first spoke up, wanting to shield her from unwanted attention or pressure from coworkers. Carter, despite his suspension, was asked to hand over every security procedure and incident record he had personally managed over the years. He agreed without resistance, a small but meaningful sign that he might still find his way toward doing better. Near the end of that long section of the night, Mason returned once more to the lobby below, his footsteps echoing across marble that had felt cold and unwelcoming only hours earlier. It had grown quiet by then, no longer loud with confrontation, only a handful of staff members standing in careful silence, watching him with expressions caught somewhere between fear and quiet respect. Mason did not want anyone there to fear him, and he made sure his voice carried no threat as he spoke. He told them plainly that starting tomorrow, this hotel would no longer need employees who knew how to bow before wealth. It would need employees who knew how to stand firmly for what was right, regardless of who was watching them do it, and regardless of how ordinary that courage might look from the outside. The next morning, the relaunch ceremony took place inside the hotel's grand ballroom, its chandeliers catching the early light that finally broke through after a night of relentless rain. Investors, journalists, business partners, and a wide cross-section of staff filled the space, the air buzzing with anticipation despite the storm that had finally passed overnight. Rumors about the previous night had already spread quietly through the building, though nobody outside the executive office yet understood the full truth of what had happened. Evelyn opened the program and introduced Mason Reed as the new owner of Reed Horizon Grand. A ripple of surprise passed through the room, since Mason looked nothing like the kind of flashy billionaire most people expected to see standing behind that podium. He wore a simple suit, no extravagant jewelry, his expression calm and unhurried as he stepped toward the podium. Mason did not begin with financial achievements or impressive figures about the acquisition. Instead, he told the room plainly that the night before he had walked into his own hotel and been refused a room because of how he looked standing at the front desk. A heavy silence settled across the ballroom almost instantly. Mason did not dwell on humiliating detail for its own sake. He said what frightened him most was not his own experience, but the realization that the same thing could easily happen to someone with no power at all to fight back against it. He announced the termination of staff members who had knowingly violated guest rights, alongside the launch of an independent internal investigation into broader patterns of mistreatment. A few investors shifted uncomfortably, worried that public scandal might damage the brand they had just invested heavily in. Mason looked directly at them and said a brand was not worth protecting if protecting it required the silence of people who had been genuinely harmed. Grace Miller raised her hand and asked whether this entire announcement amounted to personal revenge dressed up as policy reform. Mason answered simply that revenge would have unfolded quietly, far from any cameras or audience. Responsibility, by contrast, demanded daylight, demanded witnesses, demanded accountability in front of exactly the people who needed to hear it most. That answer landed with visible weight across the room. Lisa was invited onto the stage, though Mason made clear he would never force her to speak if she preferred silence. She simply stood beside Evelyn, representing every employee who had once tried to raise their voice and been quietly silenced for it. Mason announced a new training fund named after his mother, designed to help entry-level staff learn hotel management skills and access real paths toward advancement within the company. He also revealed an independent reporting line that employees could use without ever going through their direct managers, removing the very obstacle that had silenced Lisa and others like her for so long. Carter stood near the back of the room, no longer in security uniform, listening quietly without speaking, a visible reminder that consequences from the previous night had not simply evaporated with daylight. Several employees in the audience wiped away tears, struck by the strange experience of hearing a hotel owner speak about them as people rather than as line items on an operating budget. Evelyn watched Mason with something deeper than professional respect settling across her expression, a quiet recognition that grew the longer she stood beside him. She understood now that he had not simply purchased a building. He was rebuilding an entire culture from its foundation upward, one honest sentence at a time, with no interest in shortcuts that might have made the morning easier for him personally. Mason closed his remarks with a public apology directed at every guest the hotel had ever wronged before that night, his voice steady even as the weight of the words settled over the room. The room did not erupt immediately into applause. Instead, a long, heavy pause stretched across the ballroom, the kind that comes only after something true has finally been spoken aloud without flinching. Lisa began clapping, first, soft and steady, her hands trembling slightly with the effort of it. Then housekeeping staff joined her, followed by kitchen workers, junior front desk employees, maintenance crews, invited guests, and at last the entire room rose together. It became the emotional release the whole story had been building toward from its very first scene, the rain outside finally giving way to clear morning light. After the announcement, Ryan attempted to reach out to a former investor, trying to paint Mason as an emotional man, recklessly damaging a successful hotel over one isolated incident, hoping someone with influence might still take his side. But Grace Miller had already published her first article, built on clear evidence rather than sensational language, carrying genuine moral weight rather than cheap outrage designed only to attract attention. The article drew widespread public support for Mason, especially among people who had personally experienced similar treatment inside luxury spaces, meant to feel welcoming but rarely did. Investigators soon discovered Ryan had altered earlier complaint records and pressured staff members into signing statements that misrepresented what had actually occurred, a discovery that left little room for him to argue otherwise. Madison eventually requested a meeting with Mason, hoping for a chance to return to her former position. Mason agreed to meet with her, though he made no promise of reinstatement before the conversation even began. The scene needed to feel humane rather than cold, since Mason had never wanted to become someone who delighted in another person's downfall. Madison admitted, for the first time, that she finally understood what it felt like to be looked at, as though she no longer held any value as a person. Mason told her that real remorse did not begin the moment she lost her job, but the moment she truly remembered every person she had once made feel small without a second thought. He did not seek further punishment against her, but he did require her to complete an outside professional development program centered on respectful guest treatment before any hotel within the company would even consider hiring her back. Carter cooperated fully throughout the investigation, providing clear evidence that Ryan had frequently used hotel security to pressure guests into leaving without proper cause. Mason offered Carter a path back into a lower position once his suspension period ended, though without any direct supervisory authority until he completed extensive retraining. This balance mattered greatly to the larger story. Those who had acted with deliberate cruelty were removed entirely, while those capable of honest accountability were given a real, if difficult, road back. Lisa was promoted to a new role supervising both employee and guest experience, not because she had defended Mason out of loyalty, but because years of quiet observation had given her insight that executives sitting upstairs had simply never possessed. Evelyn suggested that Mason appear more often in future media coverage to help strengthen the hotel's public image going forward. Mason declined, saying he had no interest in becoming a polished symbol for cameras to admire. He simply wanted the systems beneath the surface to function with basic decency, whether or not anyone happened to be watching at the time. A brief call from Charlotte arrived near the end of this section. She asked her father if he had won. Mason looked out across the lobby and answered that he was not entirely certain it counted as winning, but that today, at least, a few people had been treated with the fairness they deserved, and that felt like enough for one long night. The scene with Charlotte stayed brief, just enough dialogue to underline the quiet heart driving everything Mason did. Evelyn overheard that answer and understood, perhaps for the first time completely, exactly what set Mason apart from every other hotel owner she had ever worked beside in her entire career. The section closed with a new sign placed quietly inside the staff corridor, reading simply that dignity never requires a reservation in advance. The night after the relaunch ceremony, Mason finally stepped into the very penthouse suite he had been refused earlier that week. The room stretched out in quiet luxury, wide windows overlooking the city below, but Mason did not feel any sense of triumph standing there. He set the sealed envelope down on the table beside a small photograph of his mother and another of Charlotte, the two images he carried with him everywhere he traveled. Evelyn arrived a short while later carrying the final report from that long day. Cancellation rates had stayed far lower than anyone had feared, letters of support had arrived from guests across the city, and staff enrollment in the new training program had grown faster than expected within just a single day. Mason thanked Evelyn for keeping her word and following the investigation through to its true end without flinching once. Evelyn told him that he was the one who had kept his word, to a hotel that had honestly never deserved someone like him standing behind it. A quiet trust had clearly settled between them, nothing forced, nothing dramatic, simply the steady kind of respect built through one long, difficult night handled with integrity. Lisa sent Evelyn a short message mentioning that the overnight staff had organized their own small session to review proper guest greeting procedures entirely on their own initiative. Mason smiled for what felt like the first genuine time since stepping through the revolving doors days earlier. He walked back down to the lobby once more, alone, without any guards trailing behind him and without a single camera following his steps. A new front desk employee, young and visibly nervous, greeted him with a natural warmth that needed no instruction or coaching behind it. Mason watched quietly as that same employee welcomed a delivery driver who had ducked inside to escape the rain. Rather than asking the driver to leave, she guided him toward a dry corner near the entrance and offered a few paper towels to dry off with. Mason found that small, unremarkable kindness more meaningful than any grand speech delivered earlier that morning in the ballroom. He understood, watching it unfold, that no hotel could ever be saved through a single dramatic decision. It could only be saved through hundreds of small, repeated acts of basic decency, carried out every single day by people nobody ever thought to thank. Grace Miller published a longer feature about the hotel owner who had once been denied a room inside his very own building. Yet the article's closing lines were not really about money or ownership at all. They focused instead on how Mason had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a new standard for simple human kindness across an entire company. Mason's called Charlotte that evening, telling her that someday, once she was a little older, he would explain exactly how one ordinary hotel room had taught him so much about what people truly deserved from each other. Charlotte simply told him she was proud of him, her voice warm even through the small speaker of his phone. Mason stood by the window afterward, looking out at the city lights scattered across the wet pavement below, remembering something his mother used to say long before any of this began. The very best hotels, she always told him, were never the ones where wealthy guests felt powerful. They were the ones where tired, ordinary people still felt entirely human the moment they walked through the door. In the final scene, Mason returned once more to the lobby and personally opened the door for an elderly guest stepping inside out of the rain. Nobody else standing nearby understood how much that small gesture truly meant. But Mason understood completely. His hotel had finally begun belonging to the values it was always meant to serve from the very beginning, long before any guest, any employee, or any rainy night had ever tested it.